Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to Local Lobat. In today's video, we are going to talk about again OpenAI, but on the series of OpenAI, today we are going to talk about a very recently released API, which is the Assistants API. And before talking or getting deeper into Assistant API, what problem does it solve? Let's talk about that. So usually ChatGPT or any OpenAI model, we were using it to parse our PDF files or passing it some code blocks to interpret or give us suggestions on our code or to improve our code basically. But the problem with GPT 3.5 or until GPT 4, you could not upload PDF files in GPT 3.5 or in ChatGPT until you have like a premium subscription, and there was no API where you could pass like an image or pass like a PDF and your GPT API or OpenAI API will understand it automatically. Now with the Assistant API, what has happened, it is allowing you to create your own assistant which will have access to things like LLM models, it will have access to files, it will have access to tools like code interpreter or retriever, and you could give it some instructions also. Like for example, in my case, in this example, I have created a personal finance assistant. So somebody who's a financial analyst or a financial person who knows how to give advice on creating retirement fund, or who knows how to give advice on savings at the end of the month. So my assistant would be, the instruction that I will give to my assistant is, hey, you are a extremely smart financial person who knows how to do savings, who know how to do retirement fund analysis, how to plan retirement funds. So be my personal assistant, and whenever I ask you any question, help me with an advice on that. Now this assistant would need access to files, so I will give it access to files. Maybe I would want this assistant to read some code also, so I will give it access to a tool called as code interpreter. Finally, it would want to connect to an LLM model like GPT-4 or 3.5. I will connect it to an LLM model also, and that's how my assistant would be ready. So now what we are going to do as a first step, we are going to create a similar assistant, not a financial bot, but we are going to create a math tutor assistant to which we can ask mathematical questions, mathematical equations, and it will answer those to us. So basically it will be my math tutor as an assistant. So without wasting any further time, what we are going to do is we are going to set up our repo. So for this, I'm using JavaScript and I'll be using Next.js to create the backend APIs, which will be eventually deployed on Vercel as a serverless function. So I have already set up my Next server. So let me show you. Here I've already set up this server, and we are going to write our APIs inside pages and inside API folder. I've created a file called as assistant.js. Not written anything here yet, because the very first thing that we will need here is we need to create a handler, which will be basically our serverless function that Next defines. So you have to create a handler here like this, and maybe to start with, we are just going to say that okay, status 200, send this, and finally we are going to export default this handler from here. To test this functionality, we are going to go to Postman and we are going to hit our, let me start my server as well here first of all, and then it is running on localhost 3000. So we are going to say localhost, this is already here, let me call this API, and I get the response back as John Doe. So my server is running now and my API is running. So now to interact with the Assistant API, if I look at the API documentation, the first thing I need to do is I need to create this assistant, and this assistant, I need to give it a name, I need to give it some instructions, I need to tell it what tool to use. In our case, because we are going to give some mathematical instructions, we are going to use code interpreter as the tool, and finally the model that we want to use. So what we are going to do is, first thing, it needs OpenAI. So we are going to install OpenAI into our system. We are going to say install OpenAI, and this is successfully installed. So now let's import this. So we're going to say okay, import OpenAI from OpenAI, and then we are going to initialize this, like this. So we need to provide an environment variable here, which we will create later on. And finally, once we have the OpenAI, let's create our assistant here. So we are going to say, okay, let me create my assistant, which is await OpenAI dot beta dot assistants dot create, and in that create I am going to first give this a name. So my assistant would be my math tutor. The model I'm going to use is, let me copy it from here, which is GPT-4 1106 preview. Instructions, let me give it some instructions that, okay, hey, you're a helpful bot or whatever. So this is already auto completed here. This is a math tutor that will help you with your math homework. Let me just rename this instruction and say you are a math tutor that will help the user with math homework. And finally we are going to give it access to tools as well, and the tools would be an array. So one of the tools that we are going to use, code interpreter, so we are going to use this. Finally, once this is ready, let's console.log it and see what comes out. Our server is any which ways running. Let's call this API again. Oh, I think I stopped my server. Let's start my server again. Let's call this API now, and it is still sending. We got some error back because OpenAI key is not provided, which is fair. So let's create an OpenAI key here. I need to create my OpenAI key, and the way it is exposed is OpenAI API key. So while I enter my OpenAI key, create my OpenAI key here, let me take a pause. Okay, now we have set up our OpenAI API key, and let's run this API again. Now let's see, we again got an error here, and it's saying to validation error, model is required, and some error is coming. Let's see, extra fields not permitted, body model field required, saying model is required. Oh, we've called it mode here, so we need to call it model. Let's run it again now, and we got the response. So let's see how our assistant looks like. So this is our assistant. It got an ID, object assistant, created ad, name, description, model, instructions, tools. Okay, so now this is ready. The next step in our understanding would be, or in our process of creating this assistant, is that whenever we are talking to an assistant, every user will have to have a thread of conversations, right? Because first I will ask, hey, can you help me with my math assignment? Second, I'll ask, can you solve this problem? So it has to have that memory, at the same time maintain the context of what my questions are. So we need to create a thread, and for creating a thread, there is an API like this, beta.openai.threads. So we are going to create a thread here, and after creating a thread, let's see what that thread looks like. We're going to call our API again. We got the response, and let's see what a thread is. Okay, we got a thread ID, and we got a created at and some metadata. Now the next step would be, we have to ask this thread some messages. We have to ask a question like a user would do. So for that, let's add a message to our thread like this, consisting of a role as a user. So we are going to copy this. We're going to go here and say, okay, OpenAI beta thread dot messages. We are going to add the message to this thread, and we are going to pass this thread ID, and we are going to ask it a question like a user. So the role will be user, and I'm going to say, I need to solve this equation, can you help me? And now let's see what this message will look like. So once we do this, we call the API again. We got a response here, and let's see, it has created a thread message. It has created some context also, but we don't see any response yet. And you see the run ID is also null, which basically means that after a thread is created, after a question or a message is asked to this thread, we need to finally run our assistant. Basically, we need to go to this step, basically run our thread or run our assistant to start the process of getting the tool, calling the LLM model, understanding the instructions, and starting to execute the instructions or the task that I've given this assistant. So how do we run this? We are going to say, okay, const run. We are going to create a run here. We are going to say await OpenAI, again beta dot. The instructions are, okay, we have to run the thread. So beta dot run threads dot run dot create, and we need to pass it a thread dot id, and we also need to pass it an assistant id. So how does that is passed? We are going to pass it like this, an assistant id. So this creates a run for us. Okay, and now if I console.log this run, what will happen is it goes into certain states. For example, if you look at XLI draw here, when we call run, the run will actually go into state like queued, it will go into in progress, it will go into completed or failed. So the response will only come when the status of the run is completed. So now what we need to do is we need to check the status of this run actually. So what we are going to do is we are going to copy this, and we are going to go into our code and say status thread id, that is a thread id, and the run id is here, and we are going to check the status, and let's see what is the first status that we get once we run this API. So once we run this API, I got some error back. Let's see what is the error. It is saying threads.run.create is an error, and what is the error? Cannot read properties of undefined. Let's see what is the problem. Beta.threads.run.create. Let's see what our API documentation says. Threads not runs. Okay, I have to create a runs actually, not run. Runs.create. We will call this API. Okay, our API is running good, and let's see the status of our run. The status of our run is in progress. Now the question is like, how long do I wait? I have to keep polling the status API to get a response. Okay, so what we are going to do is, after this we are going to maybe create a function like this. For example, we say check status, and in check status we are going to provide the thread id and the run id. Okay, and here we will say, let's say we'll create a flag called as is completed false. We'll say while is completed is not true. We are going to, this will be an async function, and we are going to say await. We are going to retrieve with this thread id, and if the status, if let's say we'll call this run status. Okay, if the run status dot status is equal to completed, we will say is complete. Otherwise we are going to await a new promise, because we are going to wait for, let's say, 2 seconds. We are creating this artificial delay here. We are going to say wait for 2 seconds and then call it back again, then this while will continue. And here instead of status, what I am going to do is I am going to say await check status with the thread id and the run id. So after my, this thing is true, after my status is complete, what I am going to do is I will retrieve the message. I will check the status again and retrieve the message. So here basically after my execution is done, I have to retrieve all the messages that my assistant has given me. So we are going to do this beta thread.messages.list for this thread id, and we are going to list the messages here. And maybe what we are going to do is now we are going to pass this messages here to our response. Okay, so everything is done. Let's call this API. Let's see what happens, and let's go to our terminal and see what's happening here. our API is executing, it is checking the status of our run of our assistant that is trying to get the data. We see something has come here. Let's see, did we get a response here? We got a response here. We got a body thread dot message, and we got the content here which says the solution to the equation is 3x plus this is equal to this. So now what we are going to do is, because we don't need to see all this response, right? So we are just going to say that okay, whatever is in the body, so here once you get the messages, we are going to say inside messages, look at body, look at data, get the 0th element out of it, and because that is the assistant message, and then the content out of it, then again content, 0th index, and then the text and the value. So we are going to say then the text and the value, and I'm going to say that this is a JSON, let's say answer, and let's save this, and finally we are going to call the API, and let's wait for the response to come back. It takes some time because every 2 seconds is actually polling the API to get the response. Now the assistant API is parsing through that equation, understanding how it is, and it has given us the solution. Certainly to solve the equation we'll need to isolate the variable. Here are the steps. This, it has given all the instructions, and therefore the solution to the equation is x equal to 1, which is perfect. 14 minus 11, 3, x equal to 3 divided by 3, that is 1. So we got our answer. So this is how the assistant API works. With this diagram we can understand that it is understanding the context, it is going into states like queued, in progress, completed, and finally once we get an answer it responds as an assistant message to the user. I hope this video was helpful to you. I hope you are able to create more assistants like this. The code and the diagram will be available in the video. Just to walk you through again, first we create an assistant here, pass it a name, a model, instructions and tools to use. Then we create a thread. In that thread we pass the messages that okay, this is the message that the user is asking. Then we create some runs for the assistant, and finally, because creating that run will actually make it go into a queued state and an in progress state, we need to keep polling the status of this run. So we keep polling the status of this run by the retrieve method, passing it the thread ID and the run ID. And once the status is completed, we retrieve the messages that the assistant has sent us on this thread particularly, and finally we respond with that message. This is how the assistant API works. Hopefully this video was helpful to you. If you like the channel, if you like the content, please subscribe to Local Lobat, and please leave any comments, any help, any next video you want me to make, and thank you so much.